Maryam Moshiri, and this is the business news on GMT. Let's turn now to Washington, where President Trump's pick for US Treasury Secretary has been sworn in. Steve Mnuchin is a former Wall Street banker who will now have a lot of responsibility for fleshing out his president's economic policies, about which we've had little detail so far. In his new role, he'll play a leading role in looking after America's taxes and debts, as well as regulating the banks. So what do we know about him? Well, Steve Mnuchin has been criticised as being a Wall Street insider, having spent 17 years working for Goldman Sachs, and also setting up and running several hedge funds. This has all enabled him to finance dozens of high-profile Hollywood films, including titles such as Suicide Squad and the hugely successful Lego Batman movie. Last April, he joined the Trump campaign to head its fundraising operations, which at that point barely existed. Well, now he's deeply involved in developing the president's tax proposals, which could deliver as much as $6 trillion in tax reductions over 10 years. Well, economist Warwick Lightfoot, who's head of economics at the Policy Exchange think tank here in London and former advisor to British finance ministers, weren't you, Warwick? Yes. Thanks for joining us here on GMT. Why has he picked this guy?
Well, I think he wanted someone he was comfortable with, someone who was not just a banker, but also a businessman. And I think it's interesting that when he was being examined by Congress, he said, look, I'm not just from Wall Street. Essentially, I'm a regional banker. I spent most of my time on the West Coast funding real businesses and turning around some of the most awkward detritus that arose out of the financial crash.
There are so many blanks, though, that Mr. Mnuchin has yet to fill in terms of economic policy, where we're heading. Have we had any clues? I mean, I think one thing he did say was, I'm committed to using the full powers of his office to create more jobs, combat terrorist activities and financing, and make America great again. Doesn't say much, does it, about what he's actually going to do?
I think the administration is very interested in a substantial tax reform bill, probably on as big a scale as anything done since the Reagan administration in 1986. And that will be very important for jobs, because it's the very high marginal tax rates that kick in at low levels of income in the United States. And there are 5 different definitions of a child within the US tax return. You think of how complicated our taxes are, their income tax is much more complex.
It is complex, but what Reagan did in the 80s was pretty aggressive in terms of the economy. Is that going to work this time?
I think there's a lot of scope to improve the tax efficiency of the US tax system, probably more scope than President Reagan and the Democrat Congress had in the 1980s. Whether there's scope simply to cut tax rates and get a result is a different matter. But the fact that you have so many tax reliefs, so many awkward definitions, all at war with themselves across the income tax and the business tax regime, I think there's a lot of scope for a reform in Congress and a Treasury Secretary and Department with an eye for detail and an element of audacity.
What about his pledge to combat terrorist activities and financing? How important is that to the Trump administration right now? Well,
it's a priority for the Trump administration. And one of the things we tend to forget is that the US Treasury Department deals with all the international affairs of the United States. So it's exchange rate management, monetary policy at the IMF and so on. But it also deals with all the money laundering arrangements and things like that. And of course, the Treasury Department has a long history in dealing with financial crime. The Secret Service, which actually takes care of the President's security detail in the White House and all the rest of it, emerged out of the Secret Service Department set up to deal with counterfeit dollar bills in the 19th century. And so there's a long history of the Treasury Department working on that. Indeed, after 9/11, my friends in the US Treasury Department told me they were spending huge amounts of time working on all those matters. So that doesn't surprise me at all.
OK, Warwick, so good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here on GMT. That's a roundup of the business news from me. Lucy, back to you.
Maryam, thank you, and happy Valentine's Day. It is Valentine's Day, of course, a day